Today I'm going to answer a question that someone asked me a few weeks ago about mixing bass and kick drum. So I'm going to show you how to mix bass and kick drum. Hey, what's going on, my friend? Chris here from MIXDOWN Online. Now, before we jump in the low end, if you're new here on the channel, subscribe to the channel, click that notification bell so you don't miss anything, and of course, for all of you, share and like this video. Okay, now let's talk about bass and kick drum. This is something very confusing for a lot of people. So, like I was saying, someone sent me a question a few weeks ago asking me how I mix my bass and kick drum so they can fit well together and I can end up with a tight low end. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to show you what I did on my last mix when it comes to bass and kick drum. It's not very complicated. The way I see things is very simple when it comes to kick and bass. But first, something very important, and this is my number one tip. If you want to know how to mix kick and bass, you need to hear what's happening down there in the low end of this frequency spectrum. And this is something very important. And this is a problem that a lot of people have, is a bad room to mix in or a bad monitoring system. But mainly bad acoustics, to be honest with you. I see that a lot. So it is going to be hard for you to listen to what's happening in the low frequency spectrum if you don't hear that low end properly. Having a good pair of monitors that will translate well in the low end is very important, and of course a minimum of acoustic treatment in your room, especially if you're mixing in a small room. Bass frequencies take a lot of space, physically speaking. So if you're mixing in a small room like a lot of people do, you're going to end up with some bass frequency problems if you don't have any room acoustic treatment. Okay, so this is something to consider. Also, something that can help, okay, that's another option that you have in front of you, is to mix in headphones when it comes to mixing the low end. Headphones, they work pretty well. Like, for example, I have a pair of Beyerdynamic DT770, which are very good, very cheap. You know, they're not too expensive. I think you can get a pair for around $200 US. I've been mixing with those headphones for the past 12 years, you know. And once you have a minimum of treatment in your room, you can also work with a system like Reference 4 from SonarWorks, which is a very cool software that can be used to get a flatter response out of your speakers. Now, when it comes to mix bass and kick, I try to keep things very simple. I don't overthink stuff, okay? Or else I'm just gonna get crazy. And there's no use anyways, because they have two different roles. A kick drum is a bit more punchy, it has a lot of transients, opposed to a bass that has way more sustain, so it has a different role, even if they dwell in the same frequency range, okay? So this is why I see them as working together, without having to fight together all the time. Sometimes it will happen that you're going to find a lot of energy in the same frequencies with the kick and the bass, and there's some things you can do to correct that. But most of the time, I don't need to do much when it comes to mixing bass and kick together. Actually, my good friend Joe Gilder produced a video on the same topic a couple months ago, and we kind of see things the same way. So if you want to check that video, it's a pretty good one actually. I'm going to leave the link on top or in the description down below. So I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to jump into my last mix, into my session, and I'm going to show you what I did on this mix and what happened with my kick and my bass. Okay, so let's have a quick listen to start with of the mix we're going to work on. So before we look at the kick and the bass, something that I also do, okay, before anything else, is I evaluate what needs to be high-passed as far as track goes. I'm not going to high-pass all the tracks except kick and bass, but I will do so on some of the tracks that I think are going to be a problem. For example, if we listen to that guitar. Okay, so what I did on this guitar, I had a high pass filter up to 120 hertz. Okay, so it doesn't change the tone of the guitar, but I'm just getting rid of the low information, the low end information. Even if I don't hear it much, it's going to add up the further I go in the mix by adding compression on individual tracks and also on instrument buses and the mix bus. At some point, that low end information is going to add up, and that can be problematic for my mix. So I high pass that that track, for example. I did the same on some pads also, where I did added a high pass filter to clear up the low end. So again, I don't do that on all the tracks, but I do on some tracks that I think might be a problem. So that helps to clear up the low end, so my kick and bass can have more space to live in. Now, high passing tracks can be a bit tricky, so I'm going to probably do a video on that in the near future, to how to properly high pass a track and the problems that can occur when high passing too much. Okay, so this is going to be for another video. Okay, now let's look at the kick drum. So if we look at the kick and the bass, okay, I'm just going to have you listen to what I have as far as the kick goes to start with. So this is a combination of my acoustic kick drum, which is not very predominant in my mix, and a sample, which is more up front. Okay, this is the sample. Now, the only thing that I have on that sample is an EQ, but that's it. You know, I have a bit of high mids that I added just to get a bit more snap and definition out of that kick drum. And this is something that I like to do if I want my kick drum to stand out in the mix. So just adding some high mids is going to do the trick. And also I have a bit of a cut at 100 hertz. And then I have a high pass filter, very low, with a 12 dB per octave slope, which is not that high, at 26 hertz. Okay, just to get a bit of control over the low end of the spectrum. And then I also have a sub kick. And this is what my sub kick sounds like. All right, what I did on this sub kick, it's actually a sample that I recorded myself years ago. You can actually download it for free if you want to. I'm going to leave the link on top. I have a R bass that I added on that sample, that sub kick sample, just to beef up the 60 hertz frequency. And then I also have a bit of an EQ just to filter out the top, okay, with a low pass filter, and also a tiny high pass filter up to 25 hertz just to tighten up the low end. And this is how it sounds like when I add that to my sample. Now I just beefed up my kick drum, which is quite nice. Now, if I look at the bass, now in this case, for this part of the song, the bass is a synth bass. It's actually a combination of 3 synth basses. Okay, first I have the main one. Now this bass is very rhythmic, so what I did as far as the EQ goes is I focused more on the mids and the high mid, okay, just to have that bass to stand out in the mix and to be able to have a better translation on smaller speakers. And this is something that I do a lot with bass, boosting the 1K region, so the bass is going to translate better on small speakers. And also I added a high pass filter up to 80 hertz, okay, which is a bit high for a bass. But in this case, it's going to work well because you're going to see why. I added also this ARP bass, which is a bit more stereo. It's more of an effect than anything else. And also I have a more sustained bass line. Now, the role of this sustained bass line is to take care of the low end of the spectrum, opposed to my rhythmic bass, which is a bit more mid, okay? And when you blend both together, you have like that complete bass sound that works very well on this mix, and this is what it sounds like. Okay, now we're going to listen to that synth bass again, okay, that low note deep bass, I call it, and look at the spectrum analyzer. Okay, now there's a lot of energy in the 60 Hertz region, okay, with that bass. And this is the same as my sub kick. So my kick drum also has a lot of energy going on at around the same frequencies. But still, they work well together because the kick drum is way more punchy opposed to the bass that has a sustained sound. So they have different roles and they complement each other pretty well. So I'm going to have you listen to the bass and the kick at the same time. All right, so now let's listen in the context of the mix, because this is what's important. By themselves, it doesn't sound super perfect, to be honest. But within the context of the mix, it's something completely different. So let's have a listen. So there you go. This is how I mixed my kick and my bass on this mix. Now, there's other techniques that I can use when it comes to mix bass and kick, but I mainly start with this. This is always my starting point, just to keep things simple. And by realizing that kick and bass are friends, okay? They work well together, so they're not always fighting. But again, if they fight, there's some techniques that you can use to fix that up. For example, side chaining the bass and the kick. That works well also. I'm gonna actually do a video on that in the future. I don't use side chaining often, okay, but in EDM, it's actually pretty useful. So anyways, that is gonna be for another video. But for today's video, this is how I mixed my kick and my bass on this song. So I hope that was helpful. If so, share and like this video. And again, if you have any questions or comments, you can leave everything down below. And don't forget to subscribe if you're new here on the channel. All right, my friend, I'm going to see you next time. Have a nice one. Ciao.